Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but I had to get over the trauma of the Tom Hooper Cats movie, but it's okay, I'm feeling good now, so let's get into it. Let's talk about Cat Tribal in EDH. Arahbo Roar of the World hails to us all the way back from Commander 2017, boasting an honestly pretty fair Eminence ability. Each combat, Arahbo will give one of our cats +3/+3, whether he's in play or in the command zone. If Arahbo is in play, he can also pay 3 mana to double up the power of other cats whenever they attack, even giving them some bonus trample. Arahbo's EDHREC page is, of course, quintessential cat tribal. For players like me who don't often dabble in tribal strategies, I think it's easy to forget just how many cats there are in Magic that care about other cats or that buff each other up, and it's easy to overlook this deck, or to kinda take it for granted, thinking that you already have the measure of how this deck will play out. But Arahbo's a clever kitty. He can pull a few tricks that I don't think most EDH players are prepared for. So let's see if we can realign this Feline by taking his average deck from the average deck feature and importing it to the Architect deck building website. As always, any swaps we make to the list must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. Like most tribal decks, the very first thing we notice from Arahbo's deck is the high creature count. 31 creatures is pretty solid, and there are a few token makers dotted around the place too. However, there's a very different dynamic to this tribal deck than for most other tribes. While most tribal decks tend to focus entirely on buffing up the whole army rather than prioritizing any single creature among the pack, Arahbo kinda deviates from that, since his effect puts a special bonus on a single creature. We still have a lot of cats that buff up the entire pack, but that small twist to the formula causes a few interesting chain reactions in this deck that we have to be cognizant of. For example, let's look at Arahbo's core cards. Most of the headliners are the creatures like Regal Caracal, King of the Pride, or Pride Sovereign, which are, of course, terrific. After that, though, things get a little trickier. Literally. Hungry Lynx, for example, can buff up the cats, but it does so in a funny way. Miri helps a whole bunch of creatures get through unblocked, and Jazal is a huge buff with enough creatures. And these effects are really cool with the cats that make tokens, such as Brimaz or Leonin Warleader. And these get especially potent with cards like Kasali Slingers, which is basically a cat tribal version of Aura Shards. But this is where things take a turn, because we also see cards here that care a lot about individuality. Skyhunter Skirmisher, Adorned Pouncer, even a Sacred Cat are really intense early game plays that Arahbo's Eminence ability will pump up for huge rewards in combat before your opponents have set up any blockers. The Double Strikers could easily get in for 8, 16, even 24 damage before opponents have established proper defenses. And all of this is helped out by some cool support pieces in the deck too, including other cat token makers, buff-ups, or even the new Unnatural Growth, which is so good here that we don't even mind that it depicts canines instead of felines. Special shout out to Traverse the Outlands too, which is an amazing card to cast after Arahbo has buffed up one of our cats in combat. Keep that interaction in mind, we're gonna come back to that later. There's one more piece of housekeeping we have to do too. This deck contains a Kahira in the 99. This is likely just a result of the way that data is traditionally drawn from the average deck feature, since we can't assume that all Arahbo players are playing with 100% cats. There are a few non-cat creatures that appear farther down in Arahbo's EDHREC data, after all. In this average deck, though, we have no creatures that would contradict this companion clause, so let's go ahead and take Kahira out of the 99 and put it as our companion. Arahbo and Kahira are basically partner commanders from now to the end of time. Just remember the errata for companions. Kahira will cost 3 mana to put from that companion zone into our hand. Alright, so I think now we have our bearings, but where can we make some improvements? Here are the 3 ways that I think we could tweak this deck. First, a section I'll call Imposters. Second, Perfect Plans. And finally, we've got to talk about the sub-theme of this deck. Let's kick it off with part 1. So I'm more of a dog person than a cat person, and I realize that that statement probably just lit the comment section on fire. Sorry, but what I'm trying to say is that I know I've got biases here. But I still think I'm correct when I say that there are some cats in this deck that aren't really pulling their weight. So I think it would be pretty cool if we free up some room in the deck so that we can let other members of the litter finally get their chance to shine. First, because of the companion, we have a free card slot to fill, and I'm gonna opt to fill it with a land. This deck's curve is decently low, but 34 lands doesn't quite do it. I'd like to throw a Bonder's Enclave in here. If we have a floofy enough creature, it'll give us extra cards. I like it, especially since our commander helps enable this effect. In fact, speaking of mana, I'd also like to swap out this Blossoming Sands for a Terramorphic Expanse. We have an Evolving Wilds in the deck already, and I'd like to get another budget fetch in here because we have a landfall card in the deck. So it would be neat to slightly increase the chances of potentially getting a double landfall trigger in a single turn. Speaking of this, I actually wanted to add one more ramp effect into this deck too. I'm going to opt for Farseek because again, I like cards that get lands onto the battlefield for us for that landfall. We'll talk more about other ramp improvement options when we discuss honorable mentions for higher and lower budget decks at the end of the video. Alright, with the basics out of the way, let's now take a look at the actual cats. I think it's fair to say that some of these leave something to be desired. Jareth is the easiest example. Card's not great, sorry. He's expensive and kinda awkward. I'm gonna be pretty ruthless here, actually. I'm also very critical of Temur Sabertooth, Alms Collector, and Felidar Sovereign. The Sovereign is super inconsistent. This is a life gain card, not a cat tribal card. We don't have a lot of life gain or life link to make this meaningful. It's mostly just clunky. Temur Sabertooth is cool, I like what it's capable of in a lot of other decks, but weirdly, in this deck, this was rarely an effect that we cared about very often. And as for the Alms Collector, I've literally only seen this card work one time. I don't mean just while I was playtesting this deck, I mean in the 5 years since it was printed, I have only seen this card do the thing one time. I just don't think this card is worth the money it costs, and I think we can find better card advantage elsewhere. I think all the cats we've cut can be replaced by better cats. And as weird as it may seem, I'm going to replace these with some changelings, which I know probably seems like cheating, but these are really good. Masked Vandal is more awesome artifact and enchantment removal. Silly as it seems, Realmwalker can get cards off the top of the deck at a much higher rate than Alms Collector, and Mirror Entity is just incredible in general. Even with 3 or 4 random creatures or tokens lying around, this thing makes combat a complete nightmare, and threatens lethal if our opponents aren't careful. That's not all though, we've got to get a Chameleon Colossus in here. I'm shocked it's not in the original list already. It's a cat with some evasion and it doubles its own power, which is exactly what our commander likes doing. These changelings might seem weird when we could play actual cat cards, but all 4 of these creatures are just genuinely great for this strategy. Those actually aren't the only cats we're going to replace in this deck, but we'll have to put that on hold for now, because we've got to move along to part 2. From laser pointers to scratching posts to expensive cat tree towers to 10-cent cardboard boxes, cats are always all about their toys. So let's see what they're playing with and take a look at this deck's support pieces. First, let's talk removal. This deck contains a Beast Within, but it doesn't yet contain a Generous Gift. Let's fix that. We definitely want both of those in here. After that, I want to take a look at that there Divine Reckoning. I don't think the flashback is all that relevant on this thing, but I do like the singularity effect for this deck, since Arahbo is so good at pumping up an individual creature to be bigger than anything anyone else has going on. I'd like to suggest a switch to Tragic Arrogance instead, which puts us directly in control of which things our opponents get to keep around. Alright, these next two are gonna make me feel a little heartless, but the Ajanis aren't great, I'm sorry. Vigilance is nice, and the -2 on the mono white Ajani is actually fine, but it's mostly just a one-time effect, and that isn't great. I promise I have something spicy in mind to replace these cards, and if you're attached to the cat theming of them, power to you. But as the deck actually goes here, I think that these are a distraction. Alright, the last cut is a relatively newer card that has been getting some early adoption in Arahbo decks, but unfortunately it hasn't quite impressed me. Glorious Sunrise. I think this effect has potential for sure, but the 5 mana cost just really bites. The Trample clause is good, and believe me, Trample is something I'll address in Section 3. But in general, none of these effects felt worth 5 mana to me. And in this thing's place, what I want to do is improve our card advantage options to help us find more mana, and creatures, and trample enablers. Plus, I promise, the cards I'm adding are pretty cool with Arahbo. Remember the Traverse the Outlands earlier? This thing is awesome to use after Arahbo has pumped up one creature, getting an additional +3 pump for tons more lands. Let's apply that same principle to our card advantage. I'm adding in Life's Legacy, Greater Good, and Momentous Fall. The sacrifice might look sad, but it just really isn't. After we clock someone for like 7, we'll draw a fresh new hand for super cheap. Yeah, that's just incredible card velocity, and we'll find a bunch of new cats and new toys to pump up and play around with as a result. Alright, our card draw has been improved, our removal has been improved, and we've mostly improved our feline force, but now it's time for the hard part. Let's go to part 3 and talk about that sub-theme. So this is going to be a difficult section, but I think it's really important for us to note that even despite the fact that this commander is now several years old, its average deck is still extremely affected by the precon effect, where the original construction of Arahbo's precon has really influenced quite a lot of card choices to this day in its deck data and the lists that people are putting online. But our cats deserve only the best, so I think it's important for us to be critical of things that are traditional. So the original pre-constructed Arahbo deck contained an equipment sub-theme. That's why we see Nizan and his hammer in this deck, for example. The precon contains several equipment that some of our Leonin care about, giving us additional things that we could do beyond just Arahbo's abilities. Some of those cats still show up in the deck data, like Kemba and Raksha, and even the newer card Armored Sky Hunter crept into the deck data as a result too. But, here's the thing. This average deck only contains 6 equipment. 6 equipment total. And with just 6, this is not a useful sub-theme. I think when I present them on screen like this, they might appear better than they actually are, or appear to be a bigger aspect of the deck than they are, but these are just total duds in this average list. 6 equipment is not enough to support these effects. Kemba will almost never make cats. Raksha is just clunky. Skyhunter just whiffs. I think it's time we release Arahbo from the yoke of the precon and let him run free as his own unique thing. These 3 cats just don't have enough density in the deck to do much of anything. I'll note that I am going to keep Nizan and his hammer in the deck, because when we draw Nizan, he automatically finds his hammer and makes himself a huge Indestructicitty, and that's worthwhile for sure, but the rest of the equipment theme needs to be critiqued. And this critique includes not just the cats that care about equipment, but the equipment themselves too. For example, I don't think green decks need Sword of the Animist for mana acceleration. This is why I added in that different ramp piece earlier, because it will get us started on a faster foot, which these cats appreciate. Arahbo's effect is really aggro, so we want to prioritize our early game speed to get in crucial points of damage. The Heirloom Blade is a bit neater, and I admit I was tempted to keep it, but it is still not the most exciting card that I think we could be playing. And I will also be harsh on the Loxodon and the Sledge here too. These are nice effects, but they're 6 mana total to make happen. That's a tall order. In a deck that cares a lot about equipment, those are not big costs, but the equipment sub-theme has slowly seeped away from Arahbo's deck data, and these are basically the last stragglers from that sub-theme that we're seeing in this average list. And if we finally take them out of the deck, we can make room for better cats and less mana-intensive synergies. These equipment are mostly useful for their trample, but if trample is what we're after, I've got cheaper ideas that we could use that I think will please us a lot more. For example, Rancor. I really like Rancor. It's 1 mana for the tramples and it never goes away. This is way more effective for us. And call me crazy, but Garruk's Uprising is really good here too, even in a deck where not all of the creatures meet the draw trigger requirement. It's a 25-cent card that grants trample, which our buff solo cats want desperately, and it will also occasionally draw us a card from a few of our big-name pets. Plus, if we have one of our cat lords out, like the King of the Pride, then our smaller cats will still trigger this thing. The trample is worth it, but there's a lot of extra upside that we can manipulate around with this guy to draw extra cards. If we want trample, both of these cards are really cheap ways to get it, both in price and in mana cost. By my calculations, this leaves us with 3 more cards to add, and since we cut 3 bad equipment cats, let's finish up by adding in 3 much better kitties. The first one looks unassuming, but I promise it's a blowout. Set's Tiger is better than it looks. Fog effects are great, and this is a flash cat that players super won't expect from such a straightforward, attack-oriented deck. On-tribe combat tricks are just too good to pass up. After that, I have to shout out Nacatl Warpride. Whenever it attacks, it creates copies of itself, and each version of the Nacatl has to be blocked. In other words, all of our other creatures are gonna make it through unblocked. And even if you just have a few buff-up effects, this will also demolish the defending player's entire board. With that Kasali Slingers in play, we do a one-sided artifact and enchantment board clear. Activate Jazal mid-combat when all of these tokens are attacking to pump up the entire team for a bazillion. Pair this up with Miri, and your opponents actually can't block all of those extra tokens. Nacatl Warpride is the coolest cat you're not yet playing. Get it in here. And finally, I'm sorry, but we have to do it. My last ad is the innocent little Lost Leonin. I know, I can't help myself. This is the best turn 2 play in the deck. Arahbo pumping this thing up to attack for a 5 infect on turn 3? Come on, it's too funny. I've been on the receiving end of this exact synergy, and even then it put a smile on my face because of how funky it is. You can't not love it. All hail Phyrexia. Alright, let's wrap it up real quick with some honorable mentions. If you're building this deck on a lower budget, what are some ways that you can save while still giving your opponents cat scratch fever? First, feel free to spruce up the removal. Budget board wipes like Cleansing Nova are perfectly good for this effect. I also think that some of the weirder cats are always worth a look, like the mutating Cub Warden, which will make us some extra tokens. And finally, I like Combat Trickery a lot in this deck. Choose your weapon doesn't look like much, but I promise it's a doozy. Out of nowhere, that attacking cat is suddenly a whole lot more of a problem than people thought. You can even use this to get a creature out of range of a Toxic Deluge, because it buffs the toughness too. And finally, to be fair to folks who still like the equipment theme of the deck, I advise sprucing up the equipment suite a whole lot more so that it doesn't feel like a fringe aspect of the deck, and specifically, check out Belt of Giant Strength when you're taking the deck in that direction. How about the inverse? What if you're buying the richest and most lavish cat toys for all of your pets? Well, there are the obvious cards like Teferi's Protection and Great Henge, which are, of course, bonkers. But I also think the ramp effects could be improved with effects like Nature's Lore and 3 Visits, which can be expensive land searcher cards to get a hold of. The lands themselves are worth a look too. Mutavault is a cat right there in the mana base, which Arahbo can pump up for super surprise swings. Very tricky. In terms of expensive equipment, should that be your preferred path for this deck, I definitely recommend prioritizing a Shadow Spear, because its effects are truly awesome, and Trample is really good for our big buff cats, especially when it's this cheap to accrue. But my number one pick for this deck is yet another combat trick, Berserk. Doubling up the power of these cats is just so good, y'all. Combined with Arahbo's Pump, this card and the Choose Your Weapon card can produce huge blowouts and take enemies by complete surprise. Plus, Berserk doesn't kill off the creature until the end of the turn, so we can still use our Life's Legacy effects on the creature we berserked in our second main phase. That is terrific stuff. Alright, that ought to do it for us. You can find a link to the decklist snoozing in a sunny spot in the description below, with the cuts in the Meowby board. I mean, in the Maybe board. Cat's all, folks! If you have any other recommendations you'd like to make for your fellow ferocious felines, make sure you leave them down in the comments below, and as always, thanks so much for watching.